Hey everyone, I'm Matt Dolan with Dolan Divorce Lawyers in Connecticut, and today what I'm going to talk about is who gets to keep the house after a divorce. So there's no bright line rule on which of the parties gets to keep the house. Ultimately, the courts have the authority to divide assets based on what the court deems to be fair and equitable. And when I say the court, I mean it's what a judge deems fair and equitable. And that's, sort of a common sense definition of fair and equitable. It basically means the judge can divide up the assets however they want based on, what they think is fair. It sort of speaks for itself. And ultimately, judges are human beings. So what one judge may deem fair and equitable, another judge may deem not fair and equitable. So it's really hard to predict what is going to happen with a house after a divorce, because ultimately judges are humans and human beings are always different. But people, most cases don't go to trial. Usually it's not a judge making a decision, and folks, particularly attorneys, will advise their clients to make decisions and try to settle their cases based on what they think a judge is most likely to do. So I suppose we'll talk about what a judge is most likely to do as far as, who they are giving the house to. So some things that the judge may look at in deciding who keeps the house is whether one of the parties is okay with the other keeping the house. So if two people who are getting divorced can reach an agreement that the husband or the wife, plaintiff or defendant, are going to keep the house, then, the court will, generally defer to any agreement that's reached. And, that's the ideal situation where people are able to agree. Another thing the court will look at is whether one of the parties is currently living in the house. So, let's say when you were married, you were living together, and, when you were starting to have trouble, or maybe after divorce began, one of the parties moved out of the house. Well, courts generally, after a trial, like to maintain the status quo for the most part. So if one of the people getting divorced is already out of the house, it's more likely that the judge will give the house to the person who is still in the house. So for that reason, if you are trying to keep the house, you should consult with your attorney before you move out of the house. You want to talk to somebody, weigh the pros and cons and what the implications are of you moving out of the house. Something else a judge may look at is whether one party has primary custody of any children. So if husband has primary custody of the kids, he's probably a little bit more likely to keep the house in order to maintain stability for the children and, have them, to prevent them needing to move into a separate residence, which could mean move to a different town. Not necessarily, obviously, but the more stability that can be, maintained for the children, the better. Something else the court may look at in deciding who should get the house after divorce is whether one of the parties owned the house already on their own before the divorce before the marriage even happened. And that especially applies to a short-term marriage. Let's say husband owned a house for 20 years, 10 years, and there's been a 2-year marriage. Well, and they're living in that house, it's more likely that the husband's going to keep that house rather than it going to the wife. It doesn't necessarily mean he's going to get the house, but that would weigh heavily in the court's mind, in determining which of the parties should keep the house. Something else the court may look at is, which of the two parties has the financial means to keep the house. Let's say the plaintiff, makes a bunch of money. It's been a short-term marriage and he has the ability to keep the house, and the defendant does not have the ability. Well, it's more likely that the judge is going to give the house to the person who has the financial means to pay for it. Obviously, if there's child support or alimony being paid, that can increase or decrease somebody's ability to pay for a house. So ultimately, those are kind of the main factors that a judge is looking at in figuring out who should keep a house. There's an infinite amount of scenarios and, things that a court could be looking at. But ultimately, if one party is keeping the house, it's not like they're just necessarily keeping it free and clear. They need to have the ability to buy the other party out of their equity in the house. So if two people, they are married, they got married and they bought a house together, and there's $100,000 of equity in that house, presumably each of them are entitled to 50% of that equity, so $50,000 each. So let's say husband keeps the house, which has $100,000 worth of equity. Well, wife should get another $100,000 asset in exchange for that. Maybe there's a bank account with $100,000, or there's a retirement account that can be transferred to her with $100,000, or maybe there's some other real estate, etc. So it's not like one just gets to keep the house. It needs to be the equity in that house needs to be dealt with. Now, that equity split isn't necessarily 50-50. Maybe it's a short-term marriage and, husband has owned the house for 20 years and it has $500,000 of equity in it. Well, if they've only been married for, 1 year and the equity didn't really increase much during that time frame, well, wife probably isn't entitled to a whole lot of equity out of the house. So she wouldn't be entitled to all that much in exchange for the husband keeping the house. So, that's kind of a case-by-case basis, figuring out who keeps the house and what, if any, claim to equity the other party has in the house. Now, another thing that needs to be considered is, if somebody is keeping the house, they generally have the obligation to remove the other person from the mortgage. So, if husband and wife had purchased a house together and they are both on the mortgage, if the wife is keeping the house, it's not necessarily fair for the husband to stay on the mortgage, because that will, he's tied to that asset, and that will limit his ability to, go out and purchase his own separate home after the divorce if he's stuck on the mortgage of $500,000 or whatever it is. So generally speaking, it'll say, wife shall retain the home, and, she shall have, 90 days or 120 days or some reasonable period of time in order to refinance the house and remove the husband from the mortgage. And if she is unable to remove the husband from the mortgage, then she has to sell the property. So there is a time frame that's usually put on that. It can be a longer time frame if there are children and they're if wife is retaining a property and there's kids that are there with her, and maybe she doesn't have a high enough income to qualify for a mortgage, that time period for her to remove the husband from the mortgage may be a little bit longer. I've seen scenarios where they, parties agree that they're not going to refinance for 10 years. That's not the norm. Usually it's a pretty short period of time, that they have to refinance. And then ultimately, one thing that you need to be aware of is the judge can also order that the house just be sold, that neither party get the house. And that's, that can often happen if there's kids. And, I said that if one person has primary custody of the kids, it's maybe more likely that they get the house. Well, it's also very possible that the judge can say, neither one of you should keep the house, because that can, create a favoritism situation with the children, or maybe the judge recognizes that neither party can afford the house on their own after the divorce. So oftentimes, if parties can't agree on who is going to keep a house, they will just order it to be sold, and the proceeds from that sale divided in a certain way, whether that's 50-50 or a different percentage. So those are the basics on who gets the house in a divorce. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to contact our office. And if you are looking for representation in a divorce or family law case, we would invite you to contact our office as well.